Good morning. Welcome to this Fingal Chamber webinar with Adare. Um, as a valued member of Fingal Chamber, of which most of you will be, you can benefit from direct advice and guidance provided by one of Ireland's leading HR, employment and law, industrial relations and health and safety consultancies through Adare. They have an expert-led team. Delighted to be joined by one of the leaders today, and they are here to help understand each of our members' needs in relation to HR, and I suppose take that on board, tailor their solutions to suit your requirements, including your membership with the chamber. You get regular communications and our newsletters via there on different HR topics. You have invitations to webinars like these and other events, and you have access to chamber partner manager where you can have one-to-one discussions around any sports you might need. Today's webinar is all around addressing or understanding and addressing the gender pay gap, and we're delighted to have Michelle McDonagh with us for the next 45 minutes or so to bring you through where we are in relation to that snapshot that's set to take place this month. So without much further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Michelle, and delighted to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, David, and welcome to everyone joining us this morning. Delighted to be with you. And as you said, David, very conscious of our strategic partnership with the Chamber, and it's very important to Adare to have that connection with the members and support them on their business journeys, which are very changeable and with many challenges. And I suppose gender pay gap reporting is another one of those challenges, or I would frame it as an opportunity. So hopefully we can share some insights with you this morning around the topic. So what we're going to go through today from an agenda perspective is, first of all, just understanding the context of gender pay gap reporting. I think it's important just to set the scene around where this has come from and why it's relevant and important for your organizations. And then, as I referenced there or indicated, it's about trying to see it more as a strategic opportunity rather than as something to be fearful of or just to try and do the bare minimum on it. I would encourage you to think a little bit more strategically, and we'll maybe touch on the importance of it from that perspective. Then I will give a little bit of granular detail around the gender pay gap legal requirements, around, exactly what the expectations are on you as employers from a compliance perspective and a legal minimum perspective. And then I'll share with you some information around their support services in that area. And then I can't close off this topic without touching on the Pay Transparency Directive, which is coming into place in Ireland next year. So as we continue our discussions on this topic, that's becoming more and more important. So I will just touch on that slightly, and then we'll go through some Q&A. I have some poll questions which we'll go through towards the end of the session, so look forward to kind of getting a better insight from you as we work through those. Great. So as David said, my name is Michelle McDonagh. I'm the head of HR consulting in Adare, and gender pay gap reporting is, I suppose, my specialist area within Adare. So I'd lead out our team in terms of working with clients around this space. So, and that's, I suppose, the reason why I think when I talk about this topic, I think understanding that context from a wider perspective before we get into the granular detail is so very important in understanding it. And that starts, on a global level, understanding what the metrics are like and what journey we're on. So from a World Economic Forum perspective, which is a good benchmark or important organization for us to consider, they place our global gender pay gap at 31.5% in 2024. And they translate that into estimating that it's going to take us 134 years to achieve pay parity if we continue to manage gender pay gap at the current pace. And that's going to take approximately 5 generations in our workplaces. So you can see straight away that the gap is wide at a global level and the pace of change is slow. And part of that is because the topic is quite a difficult topic to overcome and understand. So bringing it closer to home and focusing on our European context, I suppose from a fundamental principle perspective, in Europe, equality between men and women is a fundamental right. And that's a really important understanding to have, because that's the baseline from which we work from. And the European Commission has created a gender equality strategy from 2020 to this year, 2025. And so they've been on this journey for quite a number of years and trying to manage a change in terms of our culture from a legal perspective and also from a cultural and practical perspective in society over a number of years. But it's really only in the last number of years in Ireland that it started to be something we talk about or that's impacting us. And what that strategy set out to do was it set a priority of equal access to the economy for both women and men. And it outlined several key objectives, including closing gender gaps in the labour market. And according to that latest report from the World Economic Forum, Europe has been making significant progress in that regard over the course of that strategy, which is a really positive thing to see. Now, how that's translated into Irish legislation or Irish context is that Ireland have sought to align with those EU developments with the introduction of gender pay gap reporting into Irish law under the Gender Pay Gap Information Act of 2021. And subsequent statutory instruments. So since that gender pay gap was introduced in 2021, we've also seen a statutory instrument that came into force in 2022, and we've seen a third item of law on the next slide, a statutory instrument that came into place in 2024. And those three pieces of legislation are what we go to find the current legal basis for our requirement to produce gender pay gap reports in Ireland. So I've included there for you the full long reference, just in case you want to look those up and get kind of more insight into the legal granular basic. But essentially what it meant or what it means is that from 2022 in Ireland, organisations with 250 or more employees have been obligated to produce gender pay gap reports. And at that time, they were publishing them to their website and making them available in a publicly accessible place. From 2024, that scope widened to organisations with 150 or more employees. And this year now, in 2025, that scope widens again to organisations with 50 or more employees. Now, originally, in the first 2 years, 2022, 2023, and 2024, actually, the deadline for publication was December of each year. Now, this year in 2025, that's going to change, and the deadline is going to be November. So we have a snapshot date in June, which I'll discuss in a minute, and the deadline then is reduced to 5 months this year. So this year in Ireland, for the first time, all organisations, whether you're public or private, it doesn't matter what sector you're in, once you are an organisation with 50 or more employees, you will be obligated to produce a gender pay gap report and make it available from November of 2025. And this year, the second change that's being brought into place is that instead of placing it on your website, the government have indicated that you will be required to publish it to a central portal. Now, that portal is not yet live and active, and we don't have the links and the access for that hasn't been made available yet. But as of May 2025, in the latest government FAQ around this topic, they did confirm the fact that portal will be available and the fact that we will be able to filter data within that portal. So that's a really significant addition, I think, to that piece of information, is that when we upload our gender pay gap report to that central government portal, we will be able to filter it by maybe industry so that you can start to get a granular understanding of perhaps your competitors or a particular industry or something you're particularly interested in. And obviously from a company perspective, that's really important information as well, because it means that your report is going to be probably easier to access than it was before. Now, you can still publish it up onto your website, but the requirement will be to put it on the portal, and obviously you're encouraged to put it on your website also, but once it's up on the portal, that is satisfactory. Okay, so moving into the strategic importance of gender pay gap reporting. And in this space, I do think it's always important to start with some statistics and some metrics so that we get an understanding of, okay, so if my gender pay gap report says that our gender pay gap is 20%, so what? What does that mean? What's the benchmark? What am I judging that against in terms of understanding is it good, bad, or indifferent? So we see that the CSO reported gender pay gap in Ireland for 2022 as 9.6%. That's the last time the CSO have official public data on that. So looking forward to when that is updated and we get a more recent figure. That compares against the latest EU average, which is for unadjusted GPG of 12% in 2023, and that was 12.7% when they assessed it before that. So it is coming down, but again, relatively slowly. But 12% is the latest unadjusted EU average. Then if we look closer to home from an Irish data perspective, I'm sure we've all seen media reports around what the GPG for the state is coming out as since organisations have started to publish their gender pay gap reports. And that is suggesting that our data is 12.6% was our GPG in 2022, and that reduced to 11.2% in 2023. Now, again, in terms of even more recent data, Adare, as some of you may be familiar, run a HR barometer survey. We do it twice a year typically, and it's nationwide for all industries. So it's just an Adare survey that we do to try and get an insight on the latest trends and data that might inform our decision making for the year ahead. And in our latest barometer data where we asked this question, the gender pay gap report among survey participants came out at 10.7% in 2024. So that is indicating to us a positive trajectory in terms of organizations' efforts to bring their gender pay gap down and try to achieve, pay parity, or at least as close to pay parity as we can. It is worth also mentioning at this point the business benefits of gender pay gap reporting. So yes, we're legally required to do it and there's a legal obligation there, and of course risks if we don't do that. But there are also many business benefits to actually engaging this in a proactive way. And where this really comes to fore, I think, is that organizations have an opportunity to lead reporting their statistics and supporting those statistics with a positive narrative that demonstrates decisive action and can allow that organization to hopefully work on improving their results year on year. And rather than sitting back and either doing, a half a report or not really putting in a significant effort and presenting a poor report, I think it's just such a huge opportunity for organizations to take this on and to demonstrate their commitment to equality and to achieving optimum business performance by making sure that they are analysing their data and they are looking at their staff and their remuneration structures through a gender pay gap reporting lens, so that they are trying to support an environment with equitable pay practices for their teams. And we have to be conscious of the fact that our population is becoming much more socially conscious of this topic, and there is a growing frustration that this is a common practice in our modern day and age, and we have to try and weed that out of the fabric of our social norms and our commercial opportunities. And that is really about demonstrating that commitment to equitable pay practices and encouraging more female participation. And again, from a business perspective, what's the benefit of doing that, aside from the legal compliance element? Well, we know that these kind of actions can really enhance an organization's employer brand. They can help them to position themselves as a leading employer in the marketplace, and that's going to help them to attract talent. So in a time where our organizations need to be very competitive and are focused on being innovative and driving growth and maybe looking for opportunities in sometimes a more challenging marketplace, there is a pressure to have niche skills or particular people come in or particular skill sets come into our organizations that help us move the dial from A to B in terms of where our organization needs to get to. So anything that's going to enhance our employer brand, help us to differentiate from our competitors and attract that talent is really, really important and could really make a significant impact in terms of our ability to meet those challenges and opportunities in the marketplace. Focusing on this also drives a boost in terms of employee engagement and productivity. So when people feel that they're valued, that they're respected, that trust barometer is increasing with their employer in terms of them feeling their pay has been fairly managed, and that their organization are trying to make sure that they have equitable pay practices in place, and they're supporting their managers and their teams to have these conversations and to have these good structures. All of those things are going to increase employees' satisfaction, commitment to an organization, hopefully make them less likely to move on and leave that organization because they feel supported in the roles and in the company that they work for. And it will boost their productivity if they're happier, they're more engaged, etc. And then thirdly, it will drive as another lever or another opportunity to drive higher customer loyalty, because when you present to the marketplace as an employer where you've really tried to drive a positive language around this, and you've tried to make a positive difference, and you've presented a report that is, comprehensive and professional, then that will reflect positively on your brand and on customers' desire to work with organizations like that. So even from a tender perspective, if you're looking for investment or you're looking to align with customers who are aligned to your values, those sorts of indicators are positive for those customers and organizations to work with you. And fundamentally, we know the research tells us that by creating diverse teams, by trying to support, for example, more women in leadership roles, but also more diversity from lenses other than just gender, we know that organizations tend to perform better financially, and particularly things like innovation, decision-making skills, etc. We have a wider set of perspectives to draw on meeting those challenges. So there's many, many benefits to really taking this through a strategic lens than purely just trying to deal with it as a basic compliance requirement. So I suppose I'm just planting some seeds for you to have a think about, and more importantly, for you to talk to your own stakeholders internally about this topic and present it as an opportunity rather than another legal headache that we have to comply with. Okay, so moving into the granular a little bit more in terms of the gender pay gap reporting requirements. So the first thing you'll have heard a lot about in recent days is the snapshot date. And now we are officially in June. I can't believe how quickly the year is going. But the snapshot date that's relevant for gender pay gap reporting is June. So it's any date in June. So an organisation is obligated to select any date in June. It can be the 1st of June right through till the very last day in June. And what they have to do on that date, they have to look at how many employees are working within their organisations. And the report that they produce should be based on the calculation of those employees' remuneration for the 12-month period that precedes that snapshot date. And that's the reason you hear a lot about snapshot date and deadlines, etc. Because if you pick, for example, the 5th of, what date are we today? Yes, the 5th. If you pick the 5th of June as your snapshot date and you run your data on this date, then your deadline date will be the 5th of November for you to post that gender pay gap report onto the portal. So that's why it's important. A reduction in employees after the snapshot date will have no impact on the report, and that's important to understand. So if you have 60 employees, let's say, on the 5th of June today, and then next month you have a number of those, say 15 of those employees leave the organisation for whatever reason, and that brings you under 50, that doesn't change your obligation to report, because on the snapshot date, you're obliged to report the based on the number of employees you had on that particular date. So an organization should also just be conscious to include employees that are not necessarily rostered on that date, or if they're on any kind of leave, annual leave, etc. They're still regarded as employees in your organization, so they're still counted on that date. And anybody who's not an employee of your organization, for example, contractors, wouldn't be included in your gender pay gap report. So then looking at the detail around the information that you actually have to gather and collect. So you need to look at a classification, as I've talked about there, as to who the organization regards as an employee or not. You have to look at a classification of who has self-identified as a male or female. It's not for the organization to determine who is male and who is female. There has to be a mechanism put in place for for employees to self-identify. That's one of the nuances in this legislation, and it is a little bit different or new for Irish employment law to have that kind of requirement. So it might just need a slight tweak in terms of your process to make sure that you have opened up that opportunity for people to self-identify in terms of gender. So anyone that selects non-binary, for example, they don't want to be regarded as male or female, the GPG requirements tell us that that person should be omitted from the calculations. And that's why it's significant. We do recommend that you still, in your reporting data, that you do still detail, how many employees were in your organization, how many males, how many females, and if you did have some people that were omitted from the report for that reason, you should note how many of those people that scenario applied to. You have to collect information on all employees, including full-time, part-time, and those on leave. And that includes, detail around, so you can imagine these payroll reports or big spreadsheets with the name, the start date, the gender, the job title, the employment status. That means whether they're full-time or part-time, because we have different reporting requirements, their annual gross salary, their bonuses, and any other financial benefits, overtime pay, allowances, any other forms of compensation, including things like the vouchers people might be given at Christmas or different times of the year. So you really want to get a full account of all the various pieces that make up somebody's compensation. And we're looking at what they were actually paid in that 12-month reference period under each of those different categories. That's what you're trying to establish. You also need information on the number of hours worked by each employee for each week within the relevant pay period. And that's important because for some categories of employees, there's different methodologies for running the calculations where you might need to look at their number of hours. So understanding that is important. And again, we're looking at that 12-month reference period ending and including the snapshot date. Great. And then in terms of the actual report itself, so once you have your data collected and you've analyzing your metrics, so there's 3 different things that are required under the gender pay gap reporting. The first is that you report on your metrics, and that's the relevant mean and median figures in most cases, and also the 4 different quartiles on your gender pay gap reports. And in the next slide, I'm going to go through that in a bit more detail. But there's a metrics element to it. And in total, there's 20 different metrics that you're obligated to report. I would encourage employers, again, if for example, one of the metrics is gender pay gap amongst part-time staff. If you have no part-time staff in your organization, rather than just leaving that blank on your report, I would encourage you to put a note to say, in this reference period, we had no part-time staff employed in the organization. Because again, you're managing perception of the reader. So if the reader picks it up and they don't see a metric, their automatic thought process is that this organization didn't know enough, didn't know perhaps that they had to report that metric. But in fact, that's not the case. That metric didn't apply to you because you had no part-time staff. So things like that is a reminder, I suppose, to think about it from the reader perspective, and the fact that you're trying to tell a story. By completing this report, you're effectively creating a narrative, telling a story, and you want to take the reader on that journey. So just be conscious of that mindset when you're writing your report. The second thing is that you're required to include a paragraph on the reasons for the gender pay gap in your organization in the employer's opinion. So after you've presented your metrics, that's supported with a narrative that tells us why the organization believes the metrics have come out the way that they have. And that's where there's a huge opportunity for you as an organization to frame how that is perceived and to maybe share some information that might answer some natural queries that come up. So that's really important. And then the third piece is that you're including measures being taken by the employer to reduce the gender pay gap. So what are the 3 or 4 initiatives, maybe 5 initiatives that you're either currently doing or that you plan to do to try and move the dial? And again, I would caution people here not to just put in kind of generic best practice information, but it's really about using your own data to identify the why behind the metrics. So why the metrics, in your opinion, have come out the way that they have, and what actions are you going to take that will actually make an impact to change those metrics next year in your organization. So try and tailor it as much as you can, and that's where the report starts to take a little bit longer than we might anticipate, because for you to get real value from doing this exercise, you have to get under the detail and you have to have conversations with your stakeholders to try and understand the why behind your metrics, and then the initiatives are effectively your solution for what change you think you could make to drive a positive result next year. So as we talked about there in terms of when you have your report done, in terms of where to publish it, and it should be accessible for no less than 3 years from the date of publication. So again, when I talk about telling a story, be conscious of the fact that it's a 3-year story. So you're not just doing it in year 1 and every report is looked at in isolation. There should be a thread. So in year 1, if you set out to do A, B, and a C initiative in the hope of achieving X, Y, and Z, then in year 2, I want to see, well, did you do ABC initiative? Did you follow through? And did you get the expected result or not? And if not, why not? And how has that informed your thinking for the next 12-month period? So there needs to be a thought process behind that journey that you're on to try and reduce your gender pay gap, particularly in organizations with quite a high, which would be above those norms I talked about of, say, 12%. At the higher level, if you're anything above 12%, that becomes more and more important for you to really actively manage that gender pay gap differential and try and identify what exactly you're doing to try and make a positive change. From a complaint procedure perspective, your employees do have the right to make a referral to the WRC if they feel that their employer has not completed the gender pay gap report, or maybe they don't believe it's been done to a satisfactory level. And the WRC will do an investigation, and the outcome of that investigation may be issued to instruct the employer to comply with the regulations. The employer then can appeal that to the Labour Court. So there's no fine per se that is governed in the legislation to organisations that don't comply, but there is strength in power in terms of the WRC effectively instructing an employer to comply with the regulations. And equally, there is some teeth behind it from another avenue where the minister can instruct the IHREC, the Irish Human Rights of Equality Commission, to get a circuit court or a high court order, again, to compel the employer to comply with the regulations. So there's a number of different avenues that can come to the employer's door to force their engagement if they haven't demonstrated that straight away. So the message is do that, engage as a minimum. So I just wanted to share with you this slide, which I always think is really helpful because I've seen such a variety of gender pay gap reports, and it can be hard to get your head around, what is required. So this is a screenshot that I just pasted in from the Unpust Gender Pay Gap Report of 2024, so you can download it yourselves to have a look at it. But it's such a succinct way that they have reported all of their different 20 metrics. And So that's on the right-hand side of the screen. And then I summarize that in terms of what are the primary pieces that we have to report on. So the first thing we have to report on is the mean and median percentage gap in hourly pay for all part-time and temporary employees. We have to report the mean and the median bonus remuneration percentage of all employees. We have to report the percentage of male and female employees who received a bonus and who received benefits in kind. So there is a separation between reporting bonus and reporting benefits in kind, so being conscious of that. And finally, when we talk about quartiles, we have to report the percentage of male and female employees in 4 equal quartile pay bands. And that's lower, lower middle, and upper. So even if you're an organization that doesn't have a structure in place around banding or quartiles, the GPG requirements mean that you have to create some structure to understand your employees and their pay in 4 quartiles in a way that you can include in your reporting deadline, in your reporting information. So they're kind of the summary of what is required, and hopefully that will help you as a tick box thing, I suppose, to make sure that you've gone through each of those metrics and you're reporting on it or commentating if it doesn't apply to you. So just to touch on the difference between mean and median, because I'm sure, like me, you might have needed a refresh in terms of what this means if you're not in the world of statistics every day. So the mean is the average. That's what that means. It's found by summing up all the remunerations within a set and dividing it by the total number of employees in that set. The median then is found by ordering the group characteristics in ascending value and selecting the middle one. So they say that median is a more accurate representation of the data, because if you just take an average, you can easily have, if you have a high figure on or a low figure on either end of your spectrum, it can totally derail your average and give a misleading indicator. Whereas your median is the very central point. So when you put everybody in order, whoever is highest paid, whoever is lowest paid, the median gives you a more accurate representation. So when you're understanding your metrics and you're trying to draw out what does that tell us, I think that's an important piece to be conscious of, and to probably be leading from your median indicator more than your mean, although you're still obligated to report on your mean. And then in terms of that last piece that we're obligated to talk about, which is the strategies that the organisation is going to employ for closing the gender pay gap, there's a number of different things that organisations can do that might be relevant within your context. So just sharing some examples of those. Some of the typical or the quicker things that organizations have done is to consider recruitment approaches. So things like making sure there's gender balanced interview panels, perhaps exploring blind resume screening, so that the identifiers are not visible to the people screening CVs. So you don't know if it's a male or female. You don't know, beyond just gender, you don't know where they live. You don't know some of those variables that just create more objectivity in a screening or a selection process. Creating perhaps focus groups or forums within your organizations and looking for that feedback from employees around what their experience is and what potentially they would like the organization to look at, and getting some ideas and consultations with them. There's a lot of organizations who perhaps are in more male-dominated industries or female-dominated industries, and they're trying to achieve a better balance in terms of their gender representation. So they're starting to look at things like outreach programs with schools or universities, and increasingly we hear talk about engagement at the lowest level, so right down to primary school level, and trying to just encourage people. We hear about this from a women in STEM perspective, trying to demonstrate an opportunity, and that it is people live it and breathe it, that women should be encouraged to move into those environments. Or perhaps in your organization looking at succession planning and development and encouraging more female participation in mid to senior level roles is something that would be more valuable. So perhaps career coaching or internal training more relevant in your space. So just sharing some ideas that might resonate with you, but these are the kind of things we need to think about when we're looking at those strategies for closing our gender pay gaps. So to introduce the service that Adare have launched this year around gender pay gaps, so we've started to work with a number of different organisations to help them on their journey from an end-to-end perspective. So from a preparation perspective, in terms of helping organisations to do some test runs before we came up to June, in terms of, how easy is it for them to get this information? Are they clear on what data they need to collect? And now that we've run past some of our snapshot dates already, we're looking at analysing that data. The organisations are collecting it in real time now that the date has passed for them. So we're getting ready to start to analyse that data, collating those different metrics and using the insights that we have around those different methodologies in those varying contexts. And then we can critically assess and suggest those justifications for any pay disparities and suggest those initiatives that might make a difference in terms of that particular organisation. And of course, then present that back to the client and support them to have that narrative internally. So there can be real value sometimes in having a comfort and a confidence in using an external support to help you ensure that those methodologies are sound and that you can stand over your reporting metrics, but also then to support you from an external perspective in having a different lens without knowing the individuals in the organization to be able to spot trends or to challenge norms or processes or practices to help you unearth what changes might need to happen and to support those internal discussions with stakeholders. So I'd be more than happy to explain that or to people in any more detail. So if anyone would like Adare to contact them after the session today to talk about our service a little bit more and support you on that journey, you might just put it into the chat just now or the Q&A box, and we'll reach out to you specifically after the webinar today as a priority to support you on that preparation journey. Okay, and then I can't leave the session today without talking about the implications of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So gender pay gap reporting is the first step in Ireland, I suppose, on our journey to pay parity. But the next step is coming pretty close behind, with the Pay Transparency Directive due to be transposed into Irish law in June of next year. So that's another reason, I suppose, to encourage early adoption and engagement with gender pay gap reporting, because it will teach you how to set this up. You'll get an insight into what your metrics are already, because when the Transparency Directive is transposed, it will bring some additional complications or additional factors that really push us further on that journey to pay parity. So to touch on those, it is again going to apply to organizations at different sizes and different timeframes. So I've just shared that with you there so you can pick out your own organization. But the key difference is that from a gender pay gap reporting, we're already reporting across the whole company. But when this comes into play, we will be required to continue to do that, but to also report across categories of worker broken down by basic and variable pay. So it is going to start to get more granular in terms of subdividing our organizations and being able to look at it in a much more detailed way than we have up until this point. The second change is that it will require organizations that have a pay gap that has not been justified by objective and gender neutral factors, so that's a pay gap, of greater than 5%. And again, that's important if we think about the context of those percentages I shared with you earlier on, and they were all above 5%. So if that's true in your organization and this were to come into play today, if that gender pay gap is greater than 5%, is not justified by objective and gender neutral factors, and is not remedied within 6 months of the date of your gender pay gap report, then that organization will be obligated to engage in a joint pay assessment in consultation with employee stakeholders. So that means that there will be much more focus then on the why and the what are we doing about it and what does that mean, and really it could create an increase in claims and conflict and cases of employees saying that they feel they've been unfairly paid or remunerated. So it's so critical for us to get a handle on it now this year and to start thinking about this pay transparency directive so that we're prepared and we're in a much better position to have those conversations and justify how we manage our pay models, and stand over the methodologies that are used. It will also require employers with over 50 employees to share criteria used by workers to determine the pay levels, and the pay progression. And we have to provide that in writing of the individual pay level and the average pay levels by sex and by categories of worker for same work or work of equal value. And this is where it is going to get more complicated, because it's not necessarily just for two people doing the same job with the same title, but it's also if I do a job and I want to compare myself to someone else who I consider to be my peer, and I believe they're doing work of equal value, and I want to see how much they're being paid, and the organisation have to support me to do that. Now, how that's going to be, when it's transposed, how that's going to be defined in terms of how employers are guided to understand and assess work of equal value is yet to be determined. And, there is hope and likelihood of there being further, maybe a code to practice or some guidance given to employers to help them navigate that a little bit more. So we'll have to wait and see as the months go on what that will look like. But again, the reason I mention it today is because it's important for you to start thinking about this now and thinking about what changes you can make in your organizations in the short term to prepare you to be well positioned to deal with that in the next year ahead. And some of those preparations can involve strategic interventions and projects that you might be looking at as you come into the second half of 25 and planning to start maybe in 26. And that's why I'll share these with you now. So some of those strategic interventions could be salary and benefit benchmarking, and that's around understanding your job evaluation process. So are you clear on your job families, on your job levels, on the titles of your roles, on the descriptions that go along with those roles, the competencies that are aligned to them, the compensation structure and the career paths for those roles in your organization? And that's all the type of work we're going to have to start making sure we have robust mechanisms around. Are we clear on our total compensation and how we have set up the pay structure for a job? Have we benchmarked that externally, or is that just something internally we've decided? Because that again will become more prevalent. We're looking at things like pay transparency and compliance audits. So we talk about data review, making sure our data is solid, our GPG reporting. I've talked a little bit about recruitment processes, and taking it a step further perhaps and looking at equal pay audits. So instead of just looking at gender pay gap reporting, which we know reports across the whole organisation. So it doesn't allow for the fact that the CEO will naturally earn more money than the receptionist, just to give one example. It doesn't allow for that. It doesn't have a justification for that. It just reports the fact that the CEO is male and the receptionist is a female, in my random example, means that there will be a gender pay gap. So it can be misleading sometimes in terms of how that's represented. And so some organizations are trying to get ahead of that and actually go deeper and look at equal pay audits so that they can identify what justifications are behind those differentials, and they can start to identify if there are any real pay disparities or if they can be easily explained by those very legitimate differentiators. So action planning around that, maybe looking at your policy structure around how that's done is important. And then your pay transparency and your compliance policy framework. So as I talked about some of those changes that are coming into play around joint pay assessments, alignment to your contracts and your handbooks and how that's currently worded. And then finally, we have to talk and think a lot about pay transparency and our pay communication strategies. So what are our communication principles? how do we want to position ourselves in this space? Do we want to see it ourselves as being a leading organization? What's our values and our principles around this? And if we're taking that approach, how are we going to communicate this, both internally and externally? Do we need to segment our communications to say different things to different people? And more importantly, are we creating supporting training and toolkits for our managers to help them to start to have these conversations? And the CIPD report in 2024 has already said that there is an increase in the volume of queries and questions that managers on the ground are dealing with when it comes to pay, transparency, and wanting to know how much I earn versus my colleague or my peer. And are we really supporting our line managers to have those conversations? Are we developing those toolkits to support them? And that responsibility is shared between HR and line managers. So again, there are lots of things to think about. So at this point, I'm just going to break and ask David just to publish the poll for us, just to give us a bit of an insight, and hopefully you'll get some value then from the people in the room in terms of what their experience has been. So I'll give you a minute just to fill in those poll questions for us. Thank you. And I'll let you decide, David, when you want to close it off. So maybe give it another 30 seconds. Just 5 questions. Great. Do you want to share the results? Great, thank you. So interesting. So we have somebody that is at the 250 or more employees. That means they'll have reported already for since 2022, and then we have one organisation that has reported just last year, and nobody has reported that they're in the 50 plus. So we have more experienced people in the room, which is great. So hopefully we'll get a better understanding. So has your organisation started preparing its 2025 gender pay gap report? So we see we've started, but we're still in the early stages. And some people have said not yet, but planning to soon. Good. And then who is primarily responsible for compiling your gender pay gap data? So we're seeing HR team has come out as the top answer there. So that's interesting, because a lot of our clients or people we've talked to would say finance or payroll have been heavily involved, but it definitely does need that involvement or that leading from HR, because those initiatives are really important from a HR perspective to have insight into. And what's the biggest challenge? Understanding the methodology. Okay, really interesting. So we're still at that stage of the granular detail and trying to get the technique right and correct. And look, it's interesting that even those organizations that have reported for a number of years already are really struggling, or maybe not struggling, but it's definitely a challenge, is understanding the methodology. And of course, that's likely because the methodology keeps changing. It hasn't been the same since day one. So that's really good to know. And then the biggest challenge in terms of preparing for the directive is understanding those legal requirements. Yeah, very good. And I'd imagine that is from the fact that, obviously it's EU directive now, how that's going to be transposed or translated into Irish law will be still to be seen. So there's a bit of an unknown there. And then updating recruitment practices. Okay, that's really interesting. So definitely seeing a focus around getting prepared for some of those changes around the fact that we'll have to start publishing salaries on adverts, job adverts, etc., and stop asking people in interview processes what their current pay is. So some changes around that aspect. Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, and then I just wanted to finish off by just summarizing some of the key learnings that we have heard back from organizations that are on this journey and have been on this journey. And the first one is that it's more complex than anticipated. Maybe that resonates with the methodologies question that you talked about there. It has been more difficult. It's taken more time, and particularly where we're challenging people to think about the why, as I mentioned, in their organization. Why are the metrics the way that they are? What does that mean? What does that tell us? And then trying to create initiatives that are more tailored in that way. So definitely complexity. And that's why, we say to organizations, get ahead of it early. Try now that the snapshot or now that June is here, try and get focused on it now and get the early work put into it rather than waiting until, August, September time and thinking you can quickly turn it around and post it in November, because it just creates an anxiety and a pressure that hopefully we can avoid, and it will allow you more time for that stakeholder engagement. It is an opportunity to represent the brand. And I think there's a fear around that in terms of, people don't necessarily understand what gender pay gap means. So they might think this or they might think that. And how can we manage that narrative? So really trying to take that opportunity to represent the brand in a positive way and lead that conversation has been really important. Communication, and sometimes we forget about our internal employees as well, that they're also looking at this, and we're focused so much externally because we have to publish it on our website, but actually we should be sharing this internally with our own team. And I think that's something that people had kind of forgotten about, and then talked about the importance of doing that and managing that, how that's received within their own organization. The fact that it has prompted a revision of targeted policies and practices. So again, we talked about recruitment there for pay transparency, and I think recruitment has been something that has prompted changes already from a GPG perspective. So we've definitely seen that being one of the actions that are being taken. That's stakeholder engagement. So again, I heard of one organization that said, it was initially the responsibility of their D&I team, but now with pay transparency on the horizon, it's transferring to the reward team. So understanding, making everybody aware of the strategic imperative of the journey that we're on to pay transparency, not just GPG, and planning around that, planning responsibility, planning project teams, etc., particularly when you want people to engage in the initiatives and drive the success of whatever metrics or goals you've set yourself. And understanding that pay equity versus equal pay. So that's more around that journey to pay transparency, that being some of the learnings people have taken in terms of the importance of positioning that and understanding it for themselves. So that takes us to the end of our webinar. I'll walk you through some of our kind of key takeaways. Is really, you won't be surprised to see that ensure that you have put your maximum effort into robust GPG reporting as part of your journey to pay parity, because it really will set you up for success in that regard. Engaging with your stakeholders. And as maybe everyone on the call is not in a HR role, but it is really important that you're advocating for your team and for the employees in your organization and for those business benefits that we talked about. And you can really only do that by sharing your learning with your various stakeholders in your organization and ask for their engagement and support on the journey, so that you really are availing of the opportunity it presents and you're really trying to maximize those potential business benefits for your organization, and begin those pay transparency preparations now, particularly some of those more difficult topics or projects around. Perhaps it's workforce planning, perhaps it's your pay policies, perhaps it's trying to create some structure around your roles and how their role profiles are designed or how they're banded, and maybe it's doing some external benchmarking. All of those pieces are so important. I would encourage you to kind of act now to focus on those. So anyone that wants to reach out to me directly, I'll just share my details with you there on the screen. More than happy to have a follow-up conversation. And then I think we'll just put it out for any questions that might have come in before we wrap up. I know we only have a couple of minutes, but just check and see if there's any questions anyone wants to put out.
Thanks so much for that, Michelle. Really comprehensive overview there of the gender pay report landscape, and good tips there towards the end on next steps for people. If anyone has any questions subsequent to this live event and they'd like to follow up directly with Michelle or with ourselves in the chamber, you can get us at events@fingalchamber.ie and we'll be happy to link you in as well. And if anyone's watching this back on demand on webinar recording, then you can also do the same, and we'll link you in at a later date. I don't see any questions through the Q&A there, so thanks so much for that, Michelle,
Great.
and thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope it's been really useful to you. Thanks very much. All the best.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Davis. Enjoy the day, everyone.